Like a good Christian, 18-year-old Beth Miller always tried to follow the rules in her conservative home in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
I was raised in church, and I loved learning about the Bible, but my family was very strict. I wasn't allowed to go to dances or parties or anything like that, so I never had any boyfriends.
So in the winter of 2006, when her friends told her about a phone dating service, Beth was curious.
It was like a phone chat line. You would hear a little profile about the person, hear things that they like. I didn't know what I wanted, but I think I was really hoping to find love.
And when Beth connected with the profile of 21-year-old Adam Carrier, she was immediately intrigued.
We both had a passion for music, and that's something that really drew me to him. So we gave each other our phone numbers. I love that.
Before she knew it, the two were talking regularly, and Beth was thrilled to learn they had a ton in common.
He told me that his family was very religious, and they had a lot of the same morals and standards that my family did.
Yeah, my family was pretty strict too.
It was very nice to be able to connect with somebody that kind of understood where I was coming from.
After several weeks of nonstop phone chatter, Beth and Adam were itching to meet in person and set a date for January 15th, 2007.
As soon as I met Adam, all of my butterflies completely disappeared. I don't know if it was love at first sight, but I do think there was a very strong attraction.
The first time we ever met Adam, he seemed likable enough, but it was too soon to tell. I did not want her to rush things, but you can't tell Beth what to do.
We drove to a park and spent some time there and just got to know each other. We really liked each other in person. We just had that connection.
Adam and Beth's dates soon became a regular routine. But when her parents cautioned her to take it slow, Beth, a typical teen, decided to do the opposite.
I spent a lot of time in his apartment, so we decided to move in together pretty quickly. I was in that rebellious stage where I really didn't care what they thought because I loved him and I wanted to be with Adam.
As the two settled in together, Adam worked some short-term jobs to keep them afloat.
I didn't have a driver's license, but Adam was working steady and we were able to make ends meet.
However, Adam revealed that he had loftier career aspirations.
He really loved firefighters. When Adam talked about firefighting, he would be very excited.
I want to be a firefighter so bad.
You could see it in his face that he just loved the whole idea of it.
Beth was proud of her boyfriend and excited about their future. They even got a dog to round out their new family.
I loved having a dog. I would help him take care of it. We enjoyed going for walks and just playing together.
So Beth was surprised one day in April when Adam wanted to walk the dog alone.
I asked him if I could go with him, but he said he wanted to spend some time alone and just get some fresh air. So we argued about it for a few minutes, but I let him go.
Beth's irritation quickly turned to concern when Adam returned hours later.
He said, "Hey, there's a fire across the street. Come look at this. You can see the smoke from here." When we got to this fire, he was very excited.
Beth was surprised as Adam jumped out of the car and tried to help the firefighters.
I just didn't understand why he was so passionate about it. But I really thought that he genuinely wanted to help other people.
But helping others was the last thing on Adam's mind. He had something much more sinister planned.
He was hiding this other side of him.
No one had any idea what Adam was doing.
It was a shock. I didn't think he would ever take it that far.
In the spring of 2007, Beth Miller was playing house with her new boyfriend, Adam Carrier.
I loved living with Adam. I had never met anybody in my life that I connected with the way that I did with him.
While life in the love nest was peaceful, Beth couldn't ignore her parents' disdain.
Beth was raised in a Christian home, but in our way of thinking, living together outside the bonds of marriage is a sin against God.
So to us, the only option was to get married. I didn't feel like I would ever find anyone else like him.
So after 5 months together, Beth couldn't have been happier as she walked down the aisle toward her true love.
We got married at the church that I grew up in, and my mother made my wedding dress. You could just really see that Adam was happy.
I was very shocked that she was getting married because it was sudden, but they definitely looked very, very happy and just excited.
But just a few months after the wedding, Beth was learning that real marriages had their challenges.
Adam had trouble keeping a job, and we weren't able to pay the bills or make ends meet, and it was very stressful, and it made it hard for us to get along.
Get off my back, okay?
Although there was one job that still excited Adam.
He never lost the dream of wanting to be a firefighter. If we were driving down the road and he would see a fire truck, he would just stop whatever we were doing and turn around and follow it.
With Beth's encouragement, Adam decided to apply at a local volunteer fire department. But when he learned about the extensive testing the job required, his enthusiasm waned.
Adam had a lot of trouble when he was in school, and I think maybe he was nervous. He didn't think that he would pass.
Still, the couple's main priority was paid employment in any form. So in the spring of 2008, Beth was relieved when Adam said he'd found a job at a farm equipment store.
I decided to surprise him, so I called my mother up and asked her to bring me by his work so that I could bring him some lunch. And I went inside and I asked for Adam. A manager came out and they told me he didn't work there. And said that no one had even applied there by that name. I was very embarrassed. My first thought automatically was he was doing something he shouldn't be doing. I thought maybe he was cheating.
That evening, Beth confronted Adam.
He came home like it was a regular work day.
Where were you today? I must have been at lunch. I don't know.
I let him know that I knew he hadn't been at work.
You were not there. I think you're blowing this way out of proportion.
He implied that he had just lost the job, so I let the subject go. I felt like, based on the way we were raised, we should be doing everything that we can to make our marriage work.
So for the next year, Beth kept her head down as Adam continued to work odd jobs.
Something would happen and he would quit or he would get fired. Every time he blamed it on someone else. Nothing was ever his fault.
And in April 2009, Beth couldn't take it anymore. With only one car between them and no driver's license, she landed the only job she could within walking distance.
I was just waiting tables in a pizza place, but it was a lot better financially, and we were able to take care of ourselves better.
Beth hoped their marriage would soon get back on track. But that hope would be short-lived when Beth discovered a fiery side to her husband that she never saw coming.
It never entered my mind that he could be capable of doing that.
Adam was like two different people.
I never dreamed that Adam could be capable of this kind of violence.
In the spring of 2009, Beth Carrier was working hard to repair her marriage after catching her husband in a lie.
Been at lunch. I don't know.
We're not there. Knowing that he lied to me about something important, like a job, That made me question everything else. It made me wonder if he had lied to me about other more important things.
To avoid fighting, Beth threw herself into her new job. But one day that summer, she noticed her husband was blowing off steam in an entirely different way.
Adam liked to burn things in a barrel. He wasn't like setting a fire on the ground or anything like that. They were always contained. He would just burn trash or leaves, anything that he could find.
It seemed that the only thing that hadn't changed about Adam was his desire to become a firefighter.
He bought a police scanner and he would just listen to it so that he would know when there were fires. I felt like it was just a toy. And if he had this passion, then he should be doing anything that he could to achieve that dream. But he wasn't really trying to pursue it.
Despite the trust she was losing in him, Beth wasn't prepared to call it quits just yet. Until one night in September of 2009, when everything changed.
I wasn't happy with things that he was doing in his life. I was trying to talk to him and he didn't want to listen to me, and that made me angry. I had a drink in my hand and I threw the drink down on the ground and he became extremely enraged.
Really? Oh, you're gonna get
And I was very afraid. I knew then that I had to do whatever I could to get his hands off of me. So I dug my fingernails into his arm, and the second he let go, I ran and grabbed the phone to call 911. He grabbed a knife and cut the cord on the phone. Part of me believed that he didn't want to hurt me, but at the same time, I was terrified.
Suddenly, Adam took off.
I walked over to my parents' house. They knew right away that something was wrong. My mom proceeded to call the police, and they came and filed a report. It was overwhelming because I didn't think that things would ever escalate this far.
Luckily, Beth's physical injuries were minor, except for her broken heart.
When Beth realized her marriage was ending, she was very sad. It definitely tried, it just didn't work out. He wasn't her Prince Charming.
Over the next year, Beth tried to put her life with Adam behind her, even getting her driver's license and buying her first car. But in January of 2010, Adam found a way to creep back in.
I was at work, and one of my friends texted me, and she had been watching the news and saw his name. She sent me a link to the news channel's page.
Beth casually clicked on the link, and what she saw next would send her mind reeling. In January 2010, Beth Carrier was blindsided when she read a news article her friend texted her and saw her former husband Adam pictured in a mugshot.
I read it and found out that he had been arrested for arson. I was completely surprised. It was just very overwhelming and my mind was scattered.
Beth had no idea that just 2 weeks before, Adam had joined the West Feliciana Volunteer Fire Department as a probationary firefighter. And on January 15th, 2010, the fire department was called to extinguish 2 suspicious fires at abandoned buildings.
Both residences did not have running electricity to them, so somebody lit that fire. There was really no ignition source for a fire to start. They knew it was an arson.
And fire investigators had begun looking into a suspect, their new hire.
Adam was seen that night driving the fire truck prior to the fires being called in, almost pacing up and down the road in the fire truck like he was waiting for something. So that raised some eyebrows.
Though investigators didn't find anything in Adam's record, they uncovered more evidence that pointed right to him and brought the young fireman in for questioning.
We matched Adam's boots to the footprints that were found outside one of the buildings. His tire tracks matched the tire tracks found at the second residence. I think all this stacked together made Adam realize that he was in a no-way-out situation. That's when Adam confessed to setting the fires.
Adam admitted starting a fire at the first location and waiting for the call to come in.
I got in the fire truck and I went to an abandoned bar and I looked through the windows and I lit them on fire.
When the call didn't come in initially, he thought the fire just did not start, so he went to a second location, found an abandoned house that he lit on fire.
But when the call finally came in for the first fire, Adam responded to the second.
This raised some suspicion on what was going on because nobody else had any knowledge of the fire being over there.
Guys, where are you? I'm already at the location.
Adam told investigators he set the fires in order to bring attention to hardworking volunteer firefighters.
It just didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Not only are you damaging someone's property, but you're also putting your other firefighters at risk.
Suddenly, Adam mentioned a few other fires.
It really got the interest of the fire marshal's investigator, and it made us question how long had he been doing this.
Adam ultimately confessed to setting 8 additional fires in the surrounding areas over the last 3 years.
I was shocked to learn that one of our volunteer firefighters was a serial arsonist. A serial arsonist could have any one of a few motives. Maybe it's to cover up a crime, maybe it's for insurance, or they just like to watch things burn and like the power it gives them. I believe he had some self-esteem issues. He needed the pat on the back. And they refer to it the hero complex. Nobody knows they start the fire, but everybody will know that they're the ones that put it out and save the day.
The next day, the fire chief contacted Beth, and she was floored to learn Adam had been setting fires during their entire marriage.
That's when I realized that all of these fires that he took me to, he set. The day that he took the dog for a walk and wouldn't let me come. He was so excited when he wanted to show me this fire. Now I realize that he was bragging.
On January 28, 2010, Adam Carrier was charged with 10 counts of arson. Though no one had been injured, Adam caused over $300,000 in damages, and all signs seemed to point towards an escalation.
I think if Adam would have been able to continue, there's really no telling how it would have ended up. It may have resulted in injury for someone in a home or a firefighter.
On April 28, 2011, Adam Carrier accepted a plea deal, copping to just 2 of the 10 fires, both in West Feliciana. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison.
I think Adam is wounded and he's damaged, but I know that at some time he had good intentions. He just got lost.
Today, Beth's journey into adulthood is complete.
I still work for the same company. I've moved up and into a management position, so I feel like I've achieved a lot more on my own than I ever could have achieved without him.
Beth definitely changed because of this experience. She's more independent. She has her life together now.
I'm at a place in my life where I'm comfortable being alone. And if I don't find someone else that I trust and I love, I'll be okay because I can take care of myself now.
In the fall of 2006, 25-year-old single mom Katie Cole was seeking her footing in the adult world.
My previous relationship just didn't work out, so I was taking business administration classes and raising my daughter. It was stressful being a single mom, but I had family and friends helping out a lot.
A Staten Island cop's daughter, Katie hadn't found the right career or Mr. Right yet. But the red-haired beauty did know one thing.
I was open to finding love, finding someone to help me, raise this baby up and take part in her life.
Unfortunately, no one really stood out to Katie. Until that September while at a party, when she met a friend of a friend, Anthony Greco.
At the end of the night, I was sitting in my car and he was throwing acorns at my car to get my attention, I guess. I said to my friend, I was like, is your friend an idiot? Why is he throwing things at my car? And she said,
that's just my friend Anthony.
I guess he didn't know what to say, and that was his way of being like, hey, notice me.
And Katie couldn't help but notice how attractive the 27-year-old was.
Anthony, he was handsome.
I'm Anthony.
Katie.
On the outside, he was very rough and rugged. And I guess that's one of my faults. I always went for the bad boy.
So a few weeks later, Katie invited Anthony over for dinner. And was glad she did.
We talked about a lot of things.
So tell me about your daughter.
She's beautiful.
He did mention he wanted kids one day.
Really?
I really can't wait to have my own.
He was a foreman. His future goals were to open his own contracting company. I found Anthony's ambition and his drive to be attractive.
Over the next few weeks, Anthony began spending more and more time at Katie's house.
The relationship progressed really, really fast. Faster than I or anyone could have imagined it would. He was fantastic with my daughter. Being a single mom, it's a package deal, and a lot of guys can't handle that, and Anthony seemed to be more than happy with it.
When Katie met Anthony, he sounded like the perfect guy. He wanted to be involved with her and with her daughter. He sounded like he was able to provide her with everything that she had wanted and hoped for.
So just 2 months later, Katie and her daughter found themselves moving into Anthony's beautiful home.
He was like, the house is big enough for us, big enough for your daughter. It was moving fast, but it was moving in the right direction.
But she had no sooner moved in when drama came knocking on her new front door.
We're sitting on the couch, and it's late. Anthony said,
Oh my God, that's my ex-girlfriend.
I was like, wait, what? He said, let me go handle this. I hear her screaming, saying, you gave her the life that I was supposed to have.
I'm supposed to be here. I'm supposed to be living here with you. This shouldn't be her right now. This should be us.
I was like shocked. He's like, I'm in love with this girl, and I want to spend the rest of my life with this girl. And then she's like, all right, I'm just glad you guys are happy.
I hope you guys have a wonderful life together.
She ends up leaving.
Anthony explained the incident by telling Katie that his ex-girlfriend Melissa had never accepted their breakup.
So that was the end of it. I let it go. Anthony seemed to be someone that I could have a future with.
So that Christmas Eve, Katie was thrilled when Anthony popped the question.
I was a little surprised that he had proposed so soon, but I was happy that my granddaughter had a father figure in her life.
2 months later, Katie and Anthony said their vows in an intimate ceremony at a gorgeous lakeside club.
It was beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful. I kind of felt like, wow, I can't believe I'm actually getting the fairy tale ending.
But it wouldn't take long for Katie's fairy tale to turn into a nightmare when her husband hatched a sinister plot that would destroy her family forever.
I never saw this coming.
The lengths he went to were unbelievable.
I started crying and screaming, just tell me the truth.
In February of 2007, newlyweds Katie and Anthony Greco were raising her daughter and anxious to start a family of their own.
I felt like no matter what happens now, you know, we're starting our life and it's official.
As one of her new wifely duties, Katie decided to take over the finances and soon discovered something odd.
Anthony did not know how to pay his bills. He didn't have a bank account. The money was not enough to cover all of the bills. I mean, the mortgage was out of control high.
But Anthony reassured his bride.
Don't even worry about it.
He told Katie he recently filed a lawsuit against the builder of his house and was expecting $1 million payday.
You get about $1 million.
A lawsuit.
Anthony was confident that the money from the lawsuit would solve all the problems financially that we were having.
Trust me, I'll rob a bank for this family if I had to.
And I'm like, all right, okay.
So when Katie learned she was pregnant that May, she had every expectation that Anthony would be a provider for their family.
He always said, I want to make sure that my kids have everything I didn't have when I was growing up, and they never know the struggles that I knew.
But 4 months into her pregnancy, her husband was still struggling to make ends meet. So the two felt they had no choice but to foreclose on the house and move in with Katie's parents.
I was very excited when they moved home. I wanted them to be secure. I didn't want them to worry. A lot of people, small house, but we made it work.
Once their son was born in February 2008, Katie's hopes were bolstered by Anthony's ability as a loving father. Still, money was tight, so when Anthony suggested they move to Florida, where he was raised, Katie thought the move might be just what they needed.
He thought that it would be easier to get a job out there. It's a good place to raise kids, and I thought it would be ideal, that maybe we needed a fresh start.
So that spring, Anthony's family helped the couple rent an apartment in Tampa, and Anthony accepted a low-paying job as a security guard.
I think Anthony wanted to be the breadwinner and provider, but the money was still not enough to cover all of the bills. He kept thinking that this lawsuit's going to come and save the day. And I found out I was pregnant again. At first, I was just scared. He still wasn't able to support us, and I'm home with 2 kids. It was a sticky situation.
To add to her frustration, Katie couldn't help but notice something different about her husband in Florida.
He became more secretive. He began taking long walks at night without me. He was changed. One morning, kids were still sleeping. Anthony decided he's going to go to the gym, and he left his phone on the table. So I looked through his phone, and I found a phone number that wasn't saved for a New York cell phone.
Katie was shaken when she recognized the voice that answered as Melissa.
I was shocked. I was like, are you kidding me? This is unbelievable. She said that he was telling her, I always loved you, I always wanted to be with you. The only reason I'm with her now is because I have children with her. And I'm like, oh my God, this is not happening right now.
Katie confronted Anthony the moment he stepped foot in the door.
I saw the number on the phone. Yeah, I talked to her.
Katie, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. She called me.
I knew he was lying, but I had nobody in Florida, and I was isolated from everything. I was desperate to come home, be back in Staten Island. I told him, you're either with me or you're not, and he decided that he would rather have his family. So I gave him another chance.
So that winter, the Grecos all moved back to New York and into Katie's parents' home again. But not even the comforts of home could save Katie when her husband's strange behavior reached a whole new level.
I felt like I couldn't protect her or the grandkids.
He was really going off the deep end.
I was devastated. I never thought I would land in such a nightmare.
By the winter of 2008, after giving birth to their second child, Katie Greco and her husband Anthony had come full circle.
It was mixed emotions being back at my parents' house. I was glad because I knew we were okay and we were safe, but I felt defeated because we didn't make it in Florida.
So in November 2010, when Katie's grandfather died, the pair chose to move 85 miles away to Coopersburg, Pennsylvania.
I wanted to be closer to my grandmother, and it was more cost-effective to be up there. And the icing on the cake would be that we're not where the ex-girlfriend is.
Life seemed a little more stable for the couple. But the very next month, Katie was astounded to learn she was pregnant yet again.
I was scared to death. I mean, granted, we were grounded and things were okay for the moment, but I knew with this last baby that we were always going to struggle.
Adding to the pressure, Anthony found out that the big payday he had been expecting wasn't coming.
When Anthony found out that the lawsuit was finally going to be settled for way less than he initially planned for, he was livid. Anthony definitely spiraled out of control. He became angry, irrational. He would fight with me over a fork being in the spoon's drawer, like nonsense.
It's just a fork.
You could tell that Katie was under a lot of stress. They had 3 kids. She was pregnant with the 4th. And she just wanted to come home.
I didn't want my kids to think that this was a normal, healthy relationship. So I decided to move back to Staten Island because his anger was out of control. Anthony tried everything in his power to get me to stay, but I was done.
So in October 2012, Katie moved back home and gave birth to their 3rd child. She and Anthony were amicable and agreed to put off their custody hearing until the divorce was final.
We decided that he would take them every other weekend down to Pennsylvania. So that was fine by me. He would come get them on a Friday and return them on Sunday. They would go have a good time, come home, no problem.
But one weekend, Katie couldn't help but notice Anthony came to get the kids in a brand new car.
I walk out of the house and I'm looking for the minivan that he was driving. And he said, no, I'm driving this blue Cadillac. And I said, well, whose car is this? And he goes, oh, it's a relative of his, whatever.
And that wasn't the only change in her ex.
He looked like he got hit by a Mack truck. Forget 5 o'clock shadow. He had like 24-hour shadow.
Terrible.
Yeah, I know. I've been working late.
Something was definitely not right, but who am I to say, like, you don't look right, you're not taking the kids, you know? I just kind of like noted it.
The next evening, Katie called to say goodnight to her children as usual.
He picked up the phone. He sounded normal at first, no problem. All of a sudden, he says, I have to let you know there was an issue here. The cops were here.
What do you mean the cops were there?
And then he said, there was a robbery in the area.
Oh my God.
The person tried to get into our house. He's like, don't worry, nothing's wrong. He really didn't get into specifics, and I thought it was over at that point.
But the following morning, when Katie received a phone call from a detective, she discovered it was far from over.
They were very scared. They felt like they were going to die that day.
I was freaking out. I knew I had to get my kids away from him.
On November 12, 2012, Katie Greco received an early morning wake-up call from a detective in Quakertown, Pennsylvania.
I pick up the phone, and the man on the other end says, this is Detective so-and-so, and he proceeds to tell me that there was a bank robbery.
Robbery?
The bank robbery occurred November 8, 2012 at the TD Bank, which is in Quakertown. The man comes into the bank wearing this ridiculous ZZ Top beard. He has a gun. He gets the money, runs out the door.
Luckily, no one was hurt, and the robber only netted about $650.
He said the person fled in a vehicle, and the vehicle was found on the property that was leased to me and my husband.
When the detective told Katie the make of the vehicle, she sat in utter shock.
He said it was a dark-colored Cadillac. Does that ring a bell? Now I'm reflecting on all the events of that weekend. The crazy look in his eyes, the way he sounded when I spoke to him on Saturday. I just initially felt like I couldn't be honest. I was like, no, I don't know of a blue Cadillac.
Katie could only think about one thing.
I text Anthony. I'm freaking out, and I just could not have my kids home soon enough.
Once the children were home safely, Katie barraged Anthony with questions.
When Anthony dropped the children off, I made sure they were in the house, they were out of earshot. And I told him that the detective called. I said, I know you were driving that car. What's going on? And he's like,
It's not my car, okay? It wasn't me. I had nothing to do with it.
He assured me that everything was fine, but I knew something wasn't right.
Whatever. I'm gonna go see the kids.
I thought about him joking about robbing a bank.
Trust me, rob a bank and stay on the back.
Like, who jokes about that?
Katie was determined to get to the bottom of it. And a few weeks later, she got her chance.
He had come over, and he was having a visit with the kids, and the kids had gone to bed, and we started drinking wine. And I said,
Look, I know what you did. You need to tell me the truth.
I deserve to know the truth. You had my kids up there. I trusted you, and I want to know now. And he said,
It didn't go his way.
You actually robbed a bank?
Katie listened in horror as the father of her children confessed to hatching a plan to rob the bank with a man named Joe Scala.
Anthony Greco and Joe Scala were longtime friends. Joseph Scala had a drug problem, and he would pretty much do anything. Anthony got his gullible friend to go along with it to get some money for drugs. But Anthony Greco was the mastermind of this crime.
He's like, I was supposed to pump gas. Joe was supposed to go into the bank, do it, take off, and then if the police were following him, I was to cut the police off, causing a crash and a diversion so he could get out of, the area. I was outraged because this meant he brought my kids up there, knowing damn well what he did. So I called the lieutenant, and I said, you wanted to know if I heard anything else? And I said, well, I'm telling you what he told me. Me letting them know that he confessed to me was just icing on the cake. They had all kinds of evidence.
Cops were able to look inside the car. They saw gloves, they saw the bag, they saw all the stuff from the bank robbery.
Detectives matched the license plate from the Cadillac to Anthony Greco and the DNA from the items found in the car to Joe Scala. 4 months after the robbery, police arrested them both.
I was happy when Anthony was arrested, but I also knew that this was going to put a lot of stress on Katie. And to watch my friend go through all that was very painful.
On November 12, 2013, Anthony Greco pled guilty to 22 charges, including robbery, conspiracy, and reckless endangerment. He was sentenced to 3 to 10 years in prison. His partner in crime, Joe Scala, pled guilty to the same charges and was sentenced to 7 to 14 years in prison due to the enhanced nature of his crimes.
Anthony Greco told the judge that at the time of the bank robbery, he had 4 kids, his wife was leaving him, and he thought if he had more money, she would stay.
It was just an excuse. He was so angry and so bitter over not getting this lawsuit money that he felt was his. I think his greed got the better of him.
Today, Katie is still dealing with the aftermath of her husband's crimes.
It hurt to have to tell my kids. I can handle a lot, but to look at your kids and have to explain things, big people problems to little people, they don't get it.
If Katie ever decided to settle down again, that person would have their work cut out for them to prove themselves to be trustworthy.
But Katie still hopes that one day Anthony will have a renewed bond with his children.
As angry as I am with him, he's still their dad. And I hope that this experience will let him realize that there's more to life than your own selfishness. And your decisions affect everyone around you.
On the morning of June 6, 1996, a 911 call came from a home in Rowlett, Texas. Inside that house, 2 young boys were dying. Devin Routeux was 6 years old. His younger brother, Damon, was 5. Their mother, Darlie Routeux, was also injured. Her husband, Darren, and their youngest child were in the house as well. What happened during those early morning hours would become the center of a criminal case that has remained controversial for years. The question was not simply who had died, or whether a terrible crime had taken place. Those facts were clear. The deeper question was what had actually happened inside the Routeux home before police arrived. The case would eventually place Darlie Routeux on trial for the deaths of her 2 sons. Prosecutors argued that she had killed Devin and Damon while her husband and their youngest child were sleeping upstairs. The defense presented a different interpretation of the evidence and challenged conclusions drawn from the scene, the injuries, the emergency call, and other circumstances surrounding the incident. A court ultimately found Routeux guilty of killing her 2 sons, and she received a death sentence. Her conviction concerning Damon was upheld on direct appeal. Yet the case did not end with the verdict. The questions continued to surround the evidence and the way it had been interpreted. For those who have studied the case, the story has remained a difficult examination of what can happen when the same collection of facts is viewed through 2 opposing narratives. To understand why the case became so controversial, it is necessary to begin with what can be established, without filling the gaps with assumptions. The Routeux family lived in Rowlett, a Texas community that became known to the public through a tragedy inside one family home. On that June morning, emergency services were called after the events that had left 2 children dead and their mother injured. Police arrived to a scene that would soon become the foundation of a major investigation. There was no simple explanation waiting for investigators at the door. The house contained physical evidence that would have to be examined. Among the details that later became important were a window, a knife, marks and other signs within the home, and the injuries suffered by Darlie. Each detail could be considered on its own. But the larger question was how all of those details fit together. Then there was the 911 call. Darlie's emergency call became one of the most closely examined elements of the case. The words spoken during those first moments, the way she described what had happened, and the circumstances surrounding the call would all become part of the arguments presented later. In a case where minutes mattered, the first account could not be separated from the investigation that followed. But a 911 call is not a complete reconstruction of a crime. It is a record of a person responding to an emergency. The meaning assigned to that record depends on the interpretation of the people listening to it. In a Routeux case, that distinction became important. Investigators were confronted with a house where the victims were children, where their mother had been injured, and where other members of the family had also been present. The central task was to determine what had happened before the emergency call and whether the physical evidence supported one explanation more strongly than another. The prosecution eventually developed one narrative. According to the prosecution's case, Darlie Routeux was responsible for the deaths of Devin and Damon. The theory presented at trial was that she killed the boys while Darren and their youngest child were asleep upstairs. Under that interpretation, the events inside the home were not the result of an outside intruder, but of an attack carried out by their own mother. The defense disputed that interpretation. Rather than accepting every piece of evidence as proof of the prosecution's theory, the defense questioned how the scene had been understood. The defense also raised questions about the emergency call, the injuries, the physical evidence, and other circumstances that could, in its view, support a different explanation. That conflict would become the heart of the case. It is tempting, when looking backward at a famous criminal case, to organize every detail into a single clear story. But the Root Your case resists that simplicity. The tragedy itself is beyond dispute. Devin and Damon died. Darlie was injured. Police were called. A criminal investigation followed. A prosecution was brought. A conviction was entered. What remains difficult is the interpretation of the events between those points. The story, therefore, begins not with a conclusion, but with a question. What really happened that night? That question has survived because the evidence did not exist in isolation. Every mark, every injury, every statement, and every interpretation had to be placed into a larger account of the night. The prosecution believed that account pointed toward Darlie's guilt. The defense argued that important parts of the evidence could be understood differently. The court ultimately accepted the prosecution's case and convicted Darlie Root Your. But a verdict does not erase the questions that led people to examine a case in the first place. It establishes the legal outcome. It does not necessarily end public debate over how the evidence was interpreted. And so, before examining the trial, the appeals, or the arguments that followed, we return to the beginning, a family home in Rowlett, Texas, a June morning, 2 children who would never leave that house alive, an injured mother, and a 911 call that would become part of one of the most debated criminal cases in Texas. The first minutes mattered. The evidence mattered. And the way that evidence was understood would determine everything that came after. For the families involved, however, this was never only an argument about evidence. At its center were 2 children whose lives had ended, and a family permanently changed by what happened inside their home that morning. Before the case became a courtroom battle, before the evidence was divided into competing interpretations, there were 2 children at the center of the tragedy. Devin Root Your was 6 years old. His younger brother, Damon Root Your, was 5. Their names would later appear repeatedly in police records, court proceedings, and discussions surrounding their mother's conviction. But behind every legal document were 2 young lives that had ended inside their family home in Rowlett, Texas, during the early morning hours of June 6, 1996. The ages of Devin and Damon are among the simplest facts in the case, yet they are also among the most difficult to absorb. Devin was only 6. Damon was 5. They were brothers, separated by only a small number of years, and both were present in the family home when the events of that morning unfolded. The tragedy did not occur in an isolated location where investigators immediately knew what they were looking for. It occurred inside a home belonging to a family. That fact would become important throughout the investigation because the people connected to the house were not strangers passing through an unknown place. They were members of the same household. Darlie Root Your was the mother of Devin and Damon. She was also injured during the events of that morning. Her husband, Darren Root Your, was in the house. Their youngest child was there as well. The family therefore became inseparable from the investigation. What should have been an ordinary family residence became the center of a criminal inquiry into the deaths of 2 children. For investigators, that created an immediate and difficult question. What had happened inside the home? The answer could not simply be found by identifying the victims. Devin and Damon were dead. Their mother was injured. Other members of the family had been present. Police had to determine how the different pieces of the scene related to one another. The background of the Root Your family would eventually become part of the public understanding of the case, but the most important starting point is the household itself. There was a mother. There was a father. There were children. And on June 6, 1996, that family structure was changed permanently. The 2 boys were not abstract figures in a criminal investigation. They were the victims whose deaths gave the case its urgency and its lasting emotional weight. Every subsequent argument about evidence, every disagreement over interpretation, and every legal proceeding ultimately returned to the same fact: Devin and Damon were gone. That reality also shaped the way the investigation unfolded. When police were called to the Root Your home, they were not entering a scene connected to an ordinary dispute. They were responding to an emergency in which 2 young children had died. Their responsibility was to establish what had happened and to determine who was responsible. The house itself, therefore, became crucial. Several features of the scene would later receive significant attention. A window became part of the investigation. A knife became an important piece of evidence. Marks and other signs inside the home were examined. Darley's injuries also became part of the larger question. None of these details could be understood separately from the circumstances in which they were found. A window could be interpreted one way by investigators and another way by the defense. A knife could become significant depending on how it was connected to the events. Marks inside the house could be viewed as evidence supporting one narrative or questioned as evidence that did not necessarily establish that narrative. Darley's injuries could likewise become part of competing explanations. This was the beginning of a pattern that would continue throughout the case. The same physical environment could be described through different theories. The prosecution would eventually argue that the evidence pointed toward Darley as the person responsible for the deaths of Devin and Damon. The defense would challenge that interpretation and argue that some of the evidence could support another explanation. For the victims, however, there was no competing interpretation of what had been lost. 2 children had died. Devin was 6. Damon was 5. Their deaths would become the central facts around which everything else revolved. The presence of their younger sibling also mattered to the broader circumstances. The youngest child was in the house when the incident occurred. Darren Routier, Darley's husband, was there as well. According to the prosecution's theory presented at trial, Darren and the youngest child were sleeping upstairs while Darley killed Devin and Damon. That allegation transformed the family's home into the central question of the case. If the prosecution's version was correct, then the killings had occurred inside a household where the father and youngest child were present but, according to that theory, were not awakened in time to prevent the deaths. The defense rejected that interpretation. This distinction is important because it demonstrates why the case became more than a simple investigation into a violent event. It became an argument about reconstruction. Investigators and prosecutors had to reconstruct a sequence of events from evidence left behind. The defense had to challenge that reconstruction and propose reasons why certain details might not mean what the prosecution claimed they meant. The victims remained the fixed point in that debate. There was no uncertainty that Devin and Damon had died. The uncertainty that fueled the controversy concerned the circumstances surrounding their deaths and the identity of the person responsible. That difference is essential. A true crime investigation can contain facts that are undisputed while the meaning of those facts remains fiercely contested. The Routier case became an example of exactly that tension. The deaths were established. The emergency response was established. The presence of family members in the home was established. The criminal conviction was established. But the interpretation of the evidence remained a subject of controversy. The public would eventually encounter the case through those competing interpretations. Some would focus on the prosecution's theory. Others would question the conclusions drawn from the scene. Some would examine the 911 call. Others would concentrate on the physical evidence and Darley's injuries. Yet beneath all of those debates were Devin and Damon. Their ages make the tragedy impossible to reduce to courtroom language. 6 years old. 5 years old. The legal system would later use formal language to describe their deaths, the evidence, the charges, and the verdict. But those words could never fully capture what the loss meant to the family. For investigators, the responsibility was to establish facts. For prosecutors, the responsibility was to present a case demonstrating guilt. For the defense, the responsibility was to challenge that case. For the court, the responsibility was to determine whether the evidence supported a conviction. For the family, however, the consequences were personal and permanent. The home in Rowlett could no longer simply be understood as a place where a family lived. It became the location associated with the deaths of 2 children and the criminal case that followed. And as investigators began examining what had happened there, every part of that environment gained significance. The window, the knife, the marks, the injuries, the emergency call, the people who were inside, the people who were sleeping, and the 2 children whose lives had ended. The investigation would attempt to connect those elements into one coherent explanation. But coherence is not the same as certainty. The prosecution would eventually tell the jury that the evidence formed a clear story of what Darlie Routier had done. The defense would argue that the same evidence did not necessarily lead to that conclusion. Between those two positions stood the physical scene and the memories of the people involved. The next stage of the story would move from who the victims were to what happened inside the Routier home during the early morning hours of June 6, 1996. That was where the case truly began to take shape. And that was where the question that would follow Darlie Routier for years would become unavoidable. What exactly happened that night? Part 3, The Incident. The events of June 6, 1996, began inside the Routier family home in Rowlett, Texas, during the early morning hours. What happened there would later be reconstructed through physical evidence, the emergency call, and competing interpretations presented in court. But at the beginning, there was only a family home and a terrible emergency. Devin Routier was 6 years old. Damon Routier was 5. Both boys were inside the house when the incident occurred. Their mother, Darlie Routier, was also there. So were her husband, Darren Routier, and their youngest child. At some point during those early morning hours, a violent event took place inside the home. By the time emergency services were called, Devin and Damon had suffered fatal injuries. Darlie had also been injured. The emergency call would become one of the most important pieces of the case. For investigators, the call represented a record of the immediate aftermath. It was an account coming from inside the home while the emergency was still unfolding. What Darlie said, how she described the situation, and the circumstances surrounding the call would later be examined closely. But the call did not provide investigators with a complete explanation. It established that something terrible had happened. It did not, by itself, resolve who was responsible. That question would depend on everything investigators discovered afterward. The first challenge was the house itself. The scene contained several details that would become central to the investigation. A window drew attention. A knife became significant. There were marks and other signs within the home. Darlie's injuries also had to be considered. Each element raised questions. The window raised questions about what might have happened inside the house and whether an outside person could have been involved. The knife raised questions about its connection to the deaths. The marks in the home had to be understood in relation to the larger sequence of events. And Darlie's injuries became another part of the investigation into what had happened that morning. The significance of these details would not remain constant. As the investigation developed, they were interpreted within different theories. The prosecution would eventually argue that the evidence pointed toward Darlie as the person responsible for killing Devin and Damon. The theory presented at trial was direct and devastating. Prosecutors argued that Darlie had killed her 2 sons while Darren and the youngest child were sleeping upstairs. Under that theory, the events of the morning were not the result of an unknown person entering the home and attacking the family. Instead, the deaths had been caused by someone who was already inside. That conclusion changed the meaning of nearly every other detail. If Darlie was responsible, then the investigators had to understand the scene as part of an attack carried out by her. The evidence would be examined for indications that supported that interpretation. Her injuries would be considered within the same framework. The emergency call would be examined not simply as a plea for help, but as part of the sequence that followed the killings. The defense presented a fundamentally different interpretation. The defense challenged the prosecution's conclusions about the evidence and argued that some of the details could be understood differently. The scene, the injuries, the emergency call, and other circumstances did not necessarily prove the prosecution's version, according to the defense. This disagreement became the central conflict. It is important to distinguish between what was established and what was argued. It was established that Devin and Damon died. It was established that Darlie was injured. It was established that Darren and the youngest child were in the house. It was established that emergency services were called. But the meaning of the physical evidence and the sequence of events became matters of dispute. The investigation, therefore, became an attempt to reconstruct a period of time for which there was no simple, complete record. The people inside the home became important. The physical surroundings became important. The emergency call became important. And the injuries became important. Everything had to be examined together. The prosecution's explanation depended upon connecting these details into a single account. The defense attempted to show that the connections were not as certain as the prosecution claimed. That distinction would later become critical at trial. The scene itself contained the physical traces of an event that had already happened. Investigators could examine what remained, but they could not simply watch the incident again. They had to work backward from the evidence. That is one of the fundamental difficulties in any criminal investigation. A scene is silent. It does not explain itself. A knife does not describe why it was present. A window does not explain what happened around it. Marks inside a house do not automatically reveal their meaning. Injuries do not, without interpretation, provide an entire narrative. And a 911 call captures words spoken during an emergency, but those words still have to be understood within the surrounding circumstances. The Routier case became especially contentious because the interpretation of these details carried enormous consequences. The question was no longer simply what evidence existed. The question was what that evidence meant. The prosecution believed the pieces supported its theory of the killings. The defense believed that the pieces could support another explanation and that important questions remained unanswered. For the jury, the task would eventually be to evaluate those competing narratives. But before the case reached the courtroom, investigators had to establish as much as possible about the events inside the home. The deaths of Devin and Damon meant that the investigation could not be limited to a single question. It had to consider the entire scene and the circumstances surrounding everyone who had been present. Darley's injuries required examination. The condition of the house required examination. The knife required examination. The window required examination. The marks within the house required examination. And the emergency call had to be considered alongside all of them. Every detail potentially changed the meaning of another. If one detail appeared to support the idea of an intruder, investigators had to consider how it fit with everything else. If another detail appeared to support the prosecution's theory, that detail had to be considered in the same larger context. The investigation was therefore not simply about finding one decisive piece of evidence. It was about assembling a story. And eventually, two different stories emerged. One story said that Darley Routier had killed her sons while her husband and youngest child were sleeping upstairs. The other questioned whether the evidence truly established that conclusion. Those opposing narratives would follow the case from the investigation into the courtroom. Devin and Damon were dead. Their mother was injured. Their father and youngest sibling remained part of the circumstances surrounding the tragedy. And the home that had contained a family only hours earlier had become the center of an investigation that would change the lives of everyone connected to it. The early morning emergency call was only the beginning. Police would examine the scene. Evidence would be interpreted. Questions would emerge. The prosecution would eventually build its theory. The defense would challenge it. And as investigators moved deeper into the case, the most important question would become increasingly difficult to separate from the evidence itself. Was the scene showing investigators what had happened, or was it being interpreted through assumptions about what had happened? That question would become one of the defining tensions of the Darley Routier case. The answer would ultimately be decided in court. But before a jury could hear the competing explanations, investigators first had to determine what the evidence inside that house could actually tell them. Part 4. The investigation and the turning point. After the emergency call brought police to the Routier home in Rowlett, Texas, the investigation moved from the immediate crisis toward a much more difficult task, determining what had happened before the call was made. 2 children were dead. Darley Routier was injured. Her husband, Darren, and their youngest child had been inside the house. Every remaining detail had to be examined in the context of those facts. The investigation focused heavily on the physical scene. The house contained several elements that would later become central to the case. Investigators examined a window, a knife, marks inside the home, and Darley's injuries. These details were not simply isolated objects or observations. They became pieces of a reconstruction. The central problem was that the scene did not provide investigators with a single written explanation of what had happened. It provided physical evidence that had to be interpreted. A window could become relevant to a theory involving someone entering or leaving the house. A knife could become relevant to the deaths. Marks within the home could be considered as evidence of movement or activity. Darlie's injuries could be examined as part of the larger question of whether she had been attacked or whether the injuries had another explanation. The meaning of each detail depended upon the larger theory. That became increasingly important as investigators developed their understanding of the case. The emergency call was another major part of the investigation. Darlie's words during the call were examined because they represented the immediate account of what was happening from inside the home. The call was important not only because it summoned emergency assistance, but because the description given during those moments could later be compared with the physical evidence. This created another layer of interpretation. A statement made during an emergency could be evaluated as evidence of what the caller believed had happened. But investigators and attorneys could also examine whether the account was consistent with the physical scene. In the Root Year case, that comparison became controversial. The investigation did not end with determining that the children had died. It had to determine how the deaths occurred and who was responsible. Because other members of the family were inside the home, the circumstances surrounding their presence became significant. The prosecution eventually settled on a theory that placed responsibility on Darlie. According to the prosecution's case, Darlie Routio killed Devin and Damon while Darren and their youngest child were sleeping upstairs. This theory became the framework through which prosecutors presented the evidence. Once that theory had been established, the physical evidence could be presented as part of a sequence. The knife could be discussed in relation to the killings. The window could be discussed in relation to the possibility of an intruder. The marks inside the house could be considered in relation to the prosecution's reconstruction. Darlie's injuries could be considered in relation to the allegation that she had been the victim of an attack. And the 911 call could be considered as part of the aftermath. But the defense did not accept that framework. The defense challenged the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence and argued that important details could support another explanation. Rather than accepting the prosecution's reconstruction as the only possible account, the defense questioned whether the evidence truly established that Darlie had killed her sons. This created a fundamental problem for anyone trying to understand the case. The evidence itself was real. The disagreement concerned what the evidence proved. That distinction would become the dividing line between the two sides. A criminal investigation often depends on reconstruction. Investigators know the consequences of an event, but they may not have witnessed the event itself. They must determine what happened by examining what remains. In the Root Year case, the consequences were devastating and undeniable. 2 children had died. But the precise sequence leading to their deaths had to be reconstructed. That reconstruction required investigators to consider the physical scene, the people present, and the statements available to them. The investigation, therefore, became a process of connecting separate details. One detail could appear significant because of another detail. One interpretation could make a piece of evidence appear suspicious, while a different interpretation could make the same evidence appear less conclusive. This was one of the reasons the case would remain controversial long after the investigation ended. The prosecution believed the collection of evidence supported a clear conclusion. The defense argued that the same collection of evidence contained unresolved questions. Those questions were not merely theoretical. They affected the most important issue in the case, whether Darlie Routio was responsible for the deaths of her sons. As investigators continued examining the scene, the case moved closer to a formal accusation. Eventually, Darlie Routio was charged with the murders of Devin and Damon. The accusation transformed the investigation into a legal case. The state now had to do more than present a theory. It had to persuade a jury that the evidence established Darlie's guilt. The defense, meanwhile, had to challenge the state's interpretation and demonstrate why the evidence did not necessarily lead to the conclusion presented by prosecutors. The courtroom would therefore become another place where the physical scene was reconstructed. The window would be discussed. The knife would be discussed. The marks inside the home would be discussed. Darlie's injuries would be discussed. The 911 call would be examined. And the presence of Darren and the youngest child would become part of the prosecution's explanation of how the deaths could have occurred without them preventing the attack. The investigation had begun with an emergency. It was now becoming a question of competing narratives. One narrative presented Darlie as the person responsible for the deaths of her 2 children. The other questioned whether the evidence was sufficient to establish that conclusion beyond the necessary legal standard. The difference between those narratives was enormous. In one, the mother was the killer. In the other, the evidence had been interpreted too narrowly or incorrectly. The jury would eventually have to decide which account was supported by the evidence presented in court. But even before the trial began, the investigation had already established the central tension that would define the case. There was no dispute that something terrible had happened inside the Rutio home. The dispute was over what the physical traces meant. That distinction matters because it prevents the case from being reduced to a simple sequence of events. The deaths of Devin and Damon were facts. The conviction of their mother was a legal outcome. But the route between those two facts consisted of evidence, interpretation, argument, and judgment. The prosecution's theory gave those pieces a specific meaning. The defense questioned that meaning, and the investigation became the bridge between the tragedy of June 6th and the courtroom that would follow. By the time prosecutors prepared to present their case, the scene in Rowlett had become something more than a place where 2 children died. It had become evidence. Every physical detail could potentially support one interpretation or undermine another. The emergency call could be heard as an account of a desperate mother seeking help, or examined for inconsistencies within the prosecution's broader theory. The injuries could be understood as part of an attack against Darlie, or evaluated in the context of the state's allegation against her. The window could be considered in connection with the possibility of an intruder, while the prosecution would offer its own interpretation of what the scene demonstrated. The knife and the marks within the house likewise became part of the larger reconstruction. None of these details could answer the case alone. Together, however, they formed the evidentiary foundation upon which the prosecution and defense would build their opposing stories. And that was the turning point. The investigation was no longer simply asking what had happened. It was beginning to ask whom the evidence pointed toward. The answer given by prosecutors was Darlie Routier. The answer challenged by the defense was that the evidence did not necessarily prove it. Soon, the question would leave the investigators' hands and enter the courtroom. There, the tragedy would be transformed into a trial. And the people who had never witnessed the events of that morning would be asked to decide what the evidence meant. The fate of Darlie Routier would depend on that interpretation. Part 5. The Trial and the Verdict. By the time the case reached court, the tragedy inside the Routier home had been transformed into a question of criminal responsibility. Devin and Damon were dead. Darlie Routier had been charged with their murders. The investigation had produced a collection of physical evidence and an emergency call, and prosecutors had developed a theory explaining how those pieces fit together. The trial would require that theory to be presented as a coherent case. The prosecution argued that Darlie was responsible for the deaths of her 2 sons. According to the theory presented at trial, she had killed Devin and Damon while her husband, Darren, and their youngest child were sleeping upstairs. That allegation was the foundation of the state's case. It meant that the deaths were not being presented as the result of an unknown person entering the home and attacking the family. Instead, prosecutors argued that the person responsible was already inside the house and that Darlie herself had carried out the killings. The evidence from the home, therefore, became central to the prosecution's presentation. The window was part of the circumstances surrounding the scene. The knife was examined as evidence connected to the deaths. Marks inside the house were considered in the reconstruction of events. Darlie's injuries were also examined. And then there was the emergency call. The call had begun as a desperate request for help. But within the courtroom, it became evidence to be evaluated. The words spoken during those critical moments were considered alongside the physical evidence and the prosecution's overall theory. This illustrates one of the most difficult aspects of a criminal trial. An event that happened in a matter of minutes can take days or weeks to reconstruct in court. The jury does not experience the event directly. Instead, jurors receive fragments, physical evidence, statements, interpretations, and arguments from attorneys. Their task is to determine whether those fragments form a sufficiently convincing account of what happened. The defense approached the evidence differently. The defense challenged the prosecution's interpretation and argued that the physical evidence did not necessarily prove the state's theory. Questions were raised about the scene, the injuries, the emergency call, and other circumstances surrounding the incident. The defense did not simply have to acknowledge that the children had died. That fact was never the central dispute. The crucial issue was whether the evidence established that Darlie had killed them. This distinction became the center of the trial. The prosecution presented one explanation. The defense challenged that explanation. The jury had to decide which interpretation was supported by the evidence. The courtroom therefore became a place where the events inside the Routier home were reconstructed without the people deciding the case having witnessed those events themselves. Every piece of evidence carried weight because it was being used to answer the same question. What happened during those early morning hours? And who was responsible? The prosecution's theory attempted to answer both questions together. Darlie, prosecutors argued, had killed Devin and Damon while the other members of the family were sleeping upstairs. The defense sought to weaken that conclusion by challenging the assumptions behind it. The debate was not simply about whether individual pieces of evidence existed. It was about whether those pieces necessarily led to the prosecution's conclusion. This is where the distinction between evidence and interpretation became especially important. A knife can be evidence. A window can be evidence. An injury can be evidence. A recorded emergency call can be evidence. But evidence becomes meaningful in a criminal trial through context. Attorneys attempt to explain what each piece means and how it connects to the larger story. The prosecution attempted to connect the evidence into a narrative of guilt. The defense attempted to demonstrate that the narrative was not as certain as the prosecution claimed. For the jury, the question was not whether the case contained disturbing circumstances. It clearly did. 2 children had been killed. Their mother had been injured. The family home contained physical evidence connected to the incident. The emergency call documented the immediate aftermath. The emotional weight of those facts was immense. But a criminal conviction could not properly rest only on emotion. The jury had to consider the evidence and the arguments presented during the trial. Ultimately, the jury found Darlie Routier guilty of killing her 2 sons. The verdict transformed the legal status of the case. Darlie was no longer simply a mother at the center of a controversial investigation. She had been convicted of the murders of Devin and Damon. The court imposed a death sentence. For the legal system, this represented the conclusion of the trial's central question. The prosecution had succeeded in persuading the jury that Darlie was responsible. The defense's alternative interpretation had not prevented the conviction. But the story did not end with the verdict. A death sentence carries the possibility of further legal proceedings, and Routier's case continued through the appellate process. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals later addressed the conviction on direct appeal. The conviction concerning Damon was upheld. That development was significant because it meant that the original verdict had survived direct appellate review. Yet legal finality and public controversy are not always the same thing. The case continued to attract questions. Those questions centered on the evidence and its interpretation. People continued to examine the circumstances of the scene, the emergency call, Darlie's injuries, the window, the knife, and other physical details. The existence of a conviction did not eliminate the debate over how the evidence had been understood. For those who accepted the prosecution's case, the evidence formed a convincing explanation of the deaths. For those who questioned the conviction, the same evidence raised unresolved issues. That divide became one of the defining characteristics of the Routier case. The verdict provided a legal answer. It did not provide universal agreement. The distinction is important when looking at the case years later. A criminal court makes a determination based on the evidence presented according to the law. Public discussion can continue afterward, sometimes for decades, because people revisit the evidence and ask whether the conclusion was correct. The Routier case became especially suited to that kind of debate because the controversy did not depend on denying that a terrible crime had occurred. No one needed to dispute the deaths of Devin and Damon. The debate concerned responsibility. It concerned reconstruction. It concerned interpretation. And it concerned whether the evidence presented at trial justified the conclusion reached by the jury. The prosecution's theory remained clear. Darlie Routier had killed her sons while her husband and youngest child were sleeping upstairs. The defense maintained that the evidence could be understood differently and questioned conclusions drawn from the scene and circumstances. The jury ultimately sided with the prosecution. Darlie Routier was convicted and sentenced to death. The conviction concerning Damon was later upheld on direct appeal. For Devin and Damon, there could be no appeal, no second interpretation, and no return to the lives they had been living before that morning. Their deaths remained the reason the entire legal process existed. For Darlie Routier, however, the verdict marked the beginning of another phase. The case would move beyond the original trial and into a longer period of legal challenges and continuing public scrutiny. The courtroom had produced a verdict. But outside the courtroom, questions remained. How should the physical evidence be interpreted? What did the emergency call reveal? What did the injuries mean? How should the scene be understood? And most importantly, did the evidence establish what the prosecution said it established? Those questions would continue to define the case. The verdict had answered the legal question for the jury, but the larger public debate was only beginning. The tragedy that began inside a family home in Rowlett had now become one of the most controversial criminal cases surrounding a Texas death sentence. 2 children had died. Their mother had been convicted. The court had imposed the ultimate punishment. And yet, for many who continued to examine the case, the central question remained exactly where it had begun. What really happened that night?